All right, folks. Thank you and welcome to today's Sovryn Tea. Thank you for joining us. My name is Magnus, and today we are joined by Peter Young and Eden Yago for a fascinating Twitter discourse. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget that Twitter Spaces are interactive, and we will be taking questions at the end. So stick around, folks. To discuss our spaces, we're joined by Peter Young here, who is the managing director of the Free Private Cities Foundation, which seeks to create an alternative for governance that goes beyond conventional political systems. As we understand, he's a proponent of the Bitcoin and Austrian School of Economics and frequently collaborates with organizations operating in these fields. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Yes, sir. And also we have our in-house guest, Eden Yago, who is a Bitcoin OG and an early contributor to the Sovryn protocol. Yago has been in the space since 2011 and has founded multiple Bitcoin-focused companies. He believes that Sovryn plays a crucial part in creating a world built on Bitcoin. So, folks, today we're going to be delving into how competing DAOs and governments are attracting new citizens, built on a framework of protecting life, property, and liberty. Free private cities, they have big ideas around the next stage of development for human coexistence, as I understand. Peter, could you tell us how free private cities came about?
Yes, very happy to provide a quick overview. So, free private cities is a concept that was invented by Tita Skabel, who is a German mining entrepreneur. And during his career, he had many interactions with governments across the world in the mining space. And that gave him lots of experience working with the legal side of what was permitted and what wasn't permitted on different sites. And this got him interested in potential ways of doing governance differently, based on a more kind of private operating model than what we have in traditional nation states. So the way in which traditional nation states work is that you tend to have a one-person, one-vote system in which there is a democratic election once every 5 years, and that determines who is in charge of the state apparatus. But with free private cities, you have a different model, which is more based on the norms of business interactions. So you have a private operating company that owns an area of land, and they have full ownership of the land, and they try and attract paying customers to be their residents on this land. So rather than having an election where the people in charge change every 5 years, you have a company that's got a profit motive and is trying to offer the best possible services to bring in citizens. And we think this changes the dynamic that you have between the people that govern territories and the people that live in them for the better, because it puts more power in the hands of people. It makes them valued paying customers. They have a clear contract with their government, so their government can't charge them for services that they didn't order. And we think that the best way that this would function is that if we had quite a minimal private operating company that provided things like policing, basic infrastructure, and some judicial services, but beyond that, people sought to provide all additional services themselves. And what this does is this keeps the fees that people pay for government, which we regard as being a service, it keeps those fees low, and it also allows people to have long-term stability about what they are and aren't allowed to do within the territory. So they can plan for the future, they can accumulate capital, and they can take a longer-term stance when it comes to setting up a business or planning for their life with their family.
So, Yago, we've heard similar ideas. You've been speaking about personal sovereignty, where mankind's no longer beholden to the will of governments. Can you speak in terms of Sovryn's long-term vision? Delve into what you've talked about before, perhaps.
Sure. So, jumping off from where Peter left off, the conception behind elections is that we need some way to figure out how society is going to work. And the way we're going to do that used to be, we're going to have a king or, some totalitarian leader or some group of technocrats, right? Usually it was technocrats in the form of religious technocrats, right? The priesthood. Or we're going to have the very, very wealthy. They will decide how we should live because they have the power. And so obviously they're going to decide how we live. And humankind moved forward from there to this idea that, just because a small number of people have the power doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to make the best decisions for everyone. In fact, it's almost certain that they won't. And so instead, what we'll do is we will let the majority of people make the decision, because we still need to have some way of making the decision. But this, of course, introduces, it certainly spreads the power, assuming it works, which it frequently doesn't. But assuming it works, even in the best case scenario, it spreads the power, but it still means that one group of people are dictating to another group of people. And this idea behind democracy is the idea of you should be able to live in a society in which you have a voice. You can vote, you can protest, you can have maybe, in the best case scenario, free speech. And so you can complain, you can have an opinion, and that's how you can influence society to be more just and to be more like the type of society that you want to live in. In parallel to that, we have a different system, which nobody ever really thought of as a way of governing the way we live our lives, but which is far more powerful in terms of being able to give people the ability to live under the conditions and rules that they would like to. And the reason it's far more powerful, the reason it's far more flexible, the reason it's far more innovative is because it's voluntary, and because it allows people to opt in to the decision rather than be forced homogeneously. And what I'm referring to is the free market. So you can take the decision, like there's two decisions that you can make, right? Do you want to be driving an electric vehicle, or do you want to be driving a vehicle that runs an internal combustion engine? Now, if that decision was made by a democracy, then the majority maybe would choose petroleum as the form of energy in the internal combustion engine, and then everyone would have to drive a vehicle of that kind. And in fact, you would go further, and we would choose between Ford and GM, and everyone would have to drive the same model of Ford. But in a free market system, different people can make different choices. I can choose to drive a Rivian or a Tesla or a Leaf or a BMW series, whatever, and my choice doesn't require you to make the same choice. I choose Coca-Cola, you choose Pepsi. It's not that we all drink Coca-Cola for 4 years and then Pepsi gets into power and we all drink Pepsi for 4 years. And the way that the free market constructs the system is by allowing people to weigh their preferences, effectively with skin in the game, and effectively pay in order to express their true preference rather than force everyone to behave according to a shared preference. So instead of focusing on voice, it focuses on opt-in and exit, right? And so there's this concept in governance, voice versus exit. If you could imagine governments working on the same principle, it would be easy for me to say, well, I don't very much like living in Nigeria. I think Finland would be a better place, and so I'll go live in Finland, or even better, I will bring Finland to me and I will live under Finland's rules. Now, I think the advantages of this to anyone is obvious, but we live in a time where there's a significant lack of imagination about how such a world could exist. And there are many different versions or ideas around how we could create a type of world where people would have more say in how they lived, because it would be based on opting in or exiting rather than on voice and forcing everyone around you to behave in the same way. And I think what we could be discussing today is different visions or versions of how that could happen. But free private cities is one way to do that, in which you have multiple different cities with a high degree of autonomy. They can have very, very different rules and rule sets. They compete with each other, so they'll have to be innovative. But it also means that people can truly choose to go to the place that treats them best. And in fact, the place that treats them best may be very, very different from the place that treats someone else best.
I suppose that begs the question from what you're saying, Yago. Peter, do you have a game plan? How are you achieving this vision? Are there places you have in mind to start this with?
Yes, there are. But before we get onto that, just a quick comment on what Yago said. I think he makes a great point in that when you choose businesses on the market, you're choosing them and you're using your buying power as a kind of means of voting for wanting to see more of this kind of service in the economy in general. And he gave a great example of Coke versus Pepsi, and we don't decide that everyone should drink Coke for 4 years and everyone should then drink Pepsi. We allow people to make these choices freely on the market, and I think that's the best way of doing things as well. And if you think about the way in which we interact with companies, I imagine lots of us have iPhones, but we don't really feel the need, generally speaking, to own Apple shares as a means of trying to have a minute voting influence on the direction of Apple. We tend to regard our primary stake in what happens with Apple as being determined by whether we buy an iPhone or not, or how frequently we buy the updated version, etc. So actually, in reality, we do have a big influence on the course of Apple, even if we're not shareholders in the company, because we have that market choice. So I think that's worth emphasizing sometimes. But in terms of where this is actually happening already, I would point to two specific projects that are taking place in Honduras at the moment, which have some functional elements of the free private cities model. They're not fully aligned to exactly what we're doing because it wasn't possible legally to get all the way there. But these two zones in Honduras were able to be created by due to a law that came into place around a decade ago that allowed for the creation of zones for economic development and employment, which are extra legal autonomous zones that are allowed to be established within the country of Honduras. So within these zones, not only can the zones be run by a private company and set their own economic policies and fiscal policies, but they can also run their own parallel legal regime, and they can also, the police in Honduras have to ask permission to go into them. So they run their own private security firms and they manage all of their affairs pretty much autonomously. So those two zones are called Prospera on the island of Rautan and Morazan, which is near to Choloma, which is one of the industrial areas near to the large city of San Pedro Sula in inland Honduras. And these two projects are relatively early stage still, but I've been encouraged by the progress they've made. I made a visit to them both in December. They've both got around 58 acres of core space, a few dozen employees. One of them's got about 9 companies registered. That's Morazan, and one of them's got about 30, if I remember correctly. So these zones do exist, and I'm tracking their progress very, very carefully and hoping that they succeed and providing support to them so that they do succeed. And these zones are already creating lots of jobs for local people, already attracting businesses. But as I say, it's still relatively early days in the grand scheme of getting these to something that we could rightly describe as a city.
Yeah, so some people might know that I actually got involved in Bitcoin to a great extent through the ZA project in Honduras, and I've been involved for close to a decade in that, and somewhat involved in the constitutional changes that allowed for the creation of these ZAs, these zones. And it's taught me a lot in terms of how difficult it is to work in the meat space in terms of making these kinds of changes, because all land that we currently have access to is monopolized by one government or another, and they are very jealous of their monopoly powers. Honduras was took a very significant step forward in terms of creating the constitutional framework and actually going and creating these ZAs. Even after the creation of the constitutional framework, which had to be created twice because it was initially rejected by the Supreme Court, it took many years to create the first zones. And unfortunately, in December, actually it was I think in November, the government of Honduras changed to be a fairly radically socialist and potentially also very corrupt government. And so I'm quite fearful of the potential future of the projects in Honduras, although they've managed to set themselves up with a great deal of protections. But it's a question of how much they'll be able to expand. But the fact that these zones were created, I think, there's this concept of having a glorious failure. Even if they do end up being a failure, I think they're going to be a glorious failure in terms of having created a framework and creating a framework and pathway towards doing this kind of thing in other places in the world. And we've seen other places in the world actually with increasing interest taking some of the ideas and some of them willing to potentially go further. And the most recent example of this, I think, is probably famously the Bitcoin city in El Salvador, where there is some thinking, although it's quite fuzzy at the moment, around creating a special kind of zone with a different type of governance from the host nation.
Well, I was just going to come back on that and say, there are political realities with new innovative projects that are challenging the status quo, and this is certainly what the projects in Honduras seek to do. But in a constructive way, I think, as we've said, they're proposing an alternative model. They're building something. They're offering people a new opportunity to come and work in these places. And if people don't want to work in them, that's fine. But if people do, then we would hope they would grow and provide a more favorable alternative to the traditional nation-state model. But yes, I would also say there are risks around it. There are constitutional protections regarding the ZAs. So to repeal the legislation overall, a 2/3 majority is required in Honduras's parliament, which the current government doesn't currently have. But there are de facto realities surrounding the fact that when a particular government is in power, and we've just had the Socialist Party elected in Honduras, Xiomara Castro's government started to operate in January, and she ran a platform that was pro and against many things, but one of her positions is that she is anti-ZA. She regards the ZAs, the Zones for Economic Development and Employment, we call them ZAs for shorthand. She regards them as a kind of undermining of Honduran sovereignty, whereas, of course, that's not how we view the situation at all. We regard them as being something that allows individual Hondurans more sovereignty because it gives them more choice to be able to move to different kinds of jurisdiction rather than just having this sort of top-down structure imposed on them that many people are dissatisfied with. And just on Bitcoin City, that's also a really interesting development. I was in El Salvador when President Bukele made the announcement at the announcement event, and it was quite a pleasant surprise, I would say, because although it's a big, ambitious project with lots of uncertainty, my organization, the Free Private Cities Foundation, is in the business of building cities and supporting cities that have a more libertarian style of governance model. And what was being proposed for Bitcoin City seemed to tick a lot of boxes for us. It had quite a low tax regime that was being supported. It seemed to be a place where they were trying to encourage innovative approaches to regulation, innovative approaches to running business. And of course, having Bitcoin as legal tender within this city and within the broader country of El Salvador, I think is a great thing because from my perspective, Bitcoin will be the currency of the future on a long enough time frame. And so countries that get a head start in that process and start to take a position as first movers within the Bitcoin space when it comes to running businesses, running businesses on Bitcoin, using Bitcoin as legal tender, as a medium of exchange, accepting taxes in Bitcoin, all of these things. These are all very positive, and we've actually been able to have some good conversations with some government representatives within El Salvador, and they seem quite open to the idea of trying something new in part of Bitcoin City, maybe, which would be more aligned to our private governance model. But those conversations are very, very early. I can only say that we've started to have some of them, and that we've had some reasonably good feedback so far. But we're watching El Salvador in general and Bitcoin City very closely, and I think that it's a very positive new development for people that are interested in alternative governance models.
What would you say in response to, say, criticism of, the same old stuff like, new colonialism, etc.? Like, are there not barriers for regular, say, Hondurans or Salvadorans to join these as compared to, a perhaps wealthy Westerner?
I don't believe so. I think that anyone is free to move to or to run or to set up a ZA. It depends on whether you have the capital to do so. There are people that have capital to do so in Honduras. There are people that have the capital to do so outside. Generally speaking, when we're talking about services, we don't tend to want to have services that are provided solely by people of the same nationality as us or the same race as us. In general, we don't really tend to know. We might know who the CEO of Apple is or the CEO of Google is, but do we know who's on their board, what nationalities they are? We don't really tend to know or care that much, frankly. And that's the same thing with governance. I think it's there is a view that people should be governed by those that are of the same nationality, or that people should live in jurisdictions where the person that is in charge or owning the territory is of the same nationality. But I don't think that's a particularly good system to have. I think that we should all be free to associate with whatever nationalities we want. And if people of a different nationality say, hey, this is my apartment, I'd like to rent it to you, or this is my free trade zone, I'd like you to come and be set up as a business there, I think that should be down to the people to decide whether they agree to it or not. And you can create a narrative about, if it's, for example, a foreigner coming in and investing in a free trade zone, you could create a narrative and say that this is some sort of, colonial arrangement. But the reality is that no one is forced to move to these areas. In the business world, these kinds of ideas of looking at people's race and nationality and saying, oh, I'm not going to use this business on that basis, are pretty rare and seem quite bizarre. And I think it's just a paradigm that we need to start changing, that, there's so much space in the world. 99.999% of the world is run on variations of the same governance model, where there is a kind of government that has some sort of structure where the leadership changes. Maybe not quite that much in terms of that, but most models, let's say 90%, are pretty similar. You do get occasional dynastic regimes like in North Korea. But what we're saying is, let's allow us to have 0.1% of the world's land, or 0.01%, and let's try something different. And if people voluntarily want to move there, then that's fine. If they don't, they don't. And we're wrong, and we've made a poor entrepreneurial judgment. But what we're saying is we should be free to have that judgment, and people who are in difficult circumstances, and there are lots of those people in Honduras and El Salvador and that region in general, should be free to make decisions for improving their own lives. And what I would say is that I've seen firsthand the way in which, when people have been given a small chance to start their own business and work for themselves and have capital that they can protect, without knowing they're not going to be troubled by local gangs or police corruption, they've been very successful. There's a lady, the first commercial resident of the Morazan development in Honduras was a lady called Rosa Agrigula, and she started off working in a corrugated iron shack on the outskirts of the development, and they said to her, we'd love you to become our first commercial resident. She was like selling food and drinks to the construction workers, and the development asked her to become the first commercial resident. She then moved in. She started investing in her rented unit. They charged her a very low rate, of course, because she wasn't making a lot of money and they wanted to have more commercial residents. But she's really thrived on this model, where basically what the development provides for her is security and an audience. And from there, she's been able to set up her own business. She's now employing 3 people. She's been able to improve her own personal situation in terms of her finances and opportunities for her children. So we've seen firsthand already that there are case studies like this, where when people are given the opportunity, they really can turn their situation around. And it's been really encouraging to see.
So I would I'd expand on that and say I think there's this assumption that nations are countries, right? We call it the nation state, right? But why are Hondurans a nation? Why are Botswanans a nation? Why is Austria a nation, right? These are imagined communities. They're invented nations. They have been invented quite consciously by the countries themselves in order to create a sense of loyalty to these countries. But we all know that the people in London have a great deal more in common with the people living in New York and the people living in Tokyo than they do with the people living in a town 50 miles away from London. Right? London voted one way in Brexit, the rest of the UK voted an entirely different way for Brexit. Anyone who looks at the politics in the United States can see that the people in New York and the people in San Francisco have one sense of the world, and the people who live in between those two places have a very different sense of the world. So what is a nation? A nation is a set of shared culture, a set of shared beliefs, and a community which has a shared mission, right? And those are the strongest and best nations. Now, the assumption that that Peter sort of kind of made, I think, when he was saying, to my mind, is looking at the world through this framework of Hondurans being a nation. And I think that the thing that's going to change, the thing that is already changing, even if we haven't noticed, is that nationhood itself is changing. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that this room is called Sovereign Nations. I think Sovereign as a project is a kind of Bitcoin nation. I think to an extent Bitcoin and Bitcoiners are a kind of nation. They have a shared set of goals, beliefs, values. They have a shared currency. A Bitcoiner can arrive in any city in the world and find other Bitcoiners who will help him, give him a place to stay, go to dinner, and have shared conversation with shared topics of interest. They read the same books, right? They read the same tweets. This is how we create nations. To a great extent, a subreddit today is more of a culturally associated grouping than is a typical nation. And so colonialism, this argument that you can coming and having people move from one place to another and buy land in one place or another is colonialism, is an artifact of this idea that the nation is the people who happen to have been born in one place rather than another, and happen to be taxed by one government rather than another. And I think it's an increasingly irrelevant way of us thinking about the communities and cultures that we are part of, as so much of the way that we decide who we are and who we connect with is done on the basis of ideas and culture that we do on a global scale through the internet. And the internet really has, in that respect, substantially changed the way culture is formed, because culture used to be monopolized and controlled by a small number of broadcasters, and now is monopolized and controlled by no one. So the way we got to this question was this idea of, like, what happens? Like, are we just going to see, like, zones where only the wealthy can enter, I think is what Magnus asked. And here, too, there's a common misconception, right? And it's a misconception based on this monopoly construct of the nation with fixed borders. Every single business out there, every single company out there, and in fact, pretty much every single religion out there, every single nation prior to the nation state out there, had a goal. And that goal was to grow because it's good for the economy, to grow because it fills one with a sense of pride, to grow because people were true believers and missionaries, and to grow because it provided power. Right? Groups want to grow. But no more. Nation states now want to keep people out. That's a very, very bizarre thing. And if nationhood was on the basis of a free market system, opting in voluntary and opting out, right, exit, I think what we would see is very, very stiff competition for more people to join. And one of the most remarkable things, economists don't have consensus around most things. They have consensus around the idea of the supply and demand curve. They have consensus around a few other things. But there is one thing that economists have a remarkable amount of consensus around, which is that one of the things which we could do to massively increase global GDP, wealth and prosperity would be to remove borders. In fact, it's been calculated that if we could remove borders and allow people to move freely, we would overnight double the global GDP. We would make, on average, every single person twice as wealthy as they are now, which is a crazy statistic. And you might ask yourself, how could that possibly be true? And the reason, one way to think about it is you've got a guy and he's living in Turkey and he's making $3,000 a year. And he moves to Germany, and he does exactly the same job. He makes kebabs, right? And now he's making $24,000 a year. What has changed, right? What's changed is not that his kebabs have gotten better, and it's not even that he's selling kebabs to wealthier people, although that's part of it. But what it is, and the fact that he's selling to wealthier people is an important part of it, is that he's literally become more productive. Now, in what way has he become more productive? When he was making kebabs for other people who weren't making a lot of money, right, he was saving them time. Now that he's making kebabs for Germans who are wealthier, he's still saving them time, but that time is worth more. And what more typically happens is that people don't move from one country to another and do exactly the same thing. They move from one country to another and they can do something new, something different, something vastly more productive. And so just by moving from one place to another, they're able to make more money. And the difference between the places where people are poor and the places where people are wealthy is primarily how strong the free market is. That's what allows people to be productive, how good the governance is. So coming back to this question of would the poor be able to enter into these types of zones? And the answer is, I think, not only would they be able to enter, they're likely to be subsidized to enter. And there are many, many ways that we would see this happening. And Peter's story, demonstrates one way. But you could also see a situation where various zones would choose to subsidize or seek out more people for the productivity of particular industries that they wanted to develop. Or what has frequently happened with immigrants in the past is they would band together, right? So if you think about, Japanese or Jewish or immigrants to America in the early part of the 20th century, or today Nigerian immigrants or Vietnamese immigrants to the US, what they'll do is they will band together, a group of them. They'll collect enough money to allow more people from their home country to come. And those people from the home country will pay them back over time with interest, because that's how much more productive those people have become. And so when you create an economic surplus by giving people access to better governance and ultimately, that is the thing which drives more productivity than anything else. That extra surplus doesn't all go to the person who moved. Part of it goes to the society that created the better governance for them. And so places which have even better governance, the places which have best governance become the most competitive and will outcompete places that have worse governance and attract more people. And so what you will end up having, in the same way that the 20th century, through the spread of the free market, lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty, will now move people from being not deathly poor anymore to lifting billions of people into wealth.
Well, I must say both of your arguments are convincing me somewhat, that's for sure. Peter, this made me, what Yago was talking about made me think of this a little bit in terms of the cities. If Dunbar's number is 150, do you know what the ideal size of one of these new cities or nations would be? Is there a size that the population gets ungovernable and democracy itself falls or fails?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I don't believe there's going to be one kind of optimal number. I think there'll be, in the future, we'll have developments that have a range of different populations. Some people will prefer to live in less populated, less dense parts of the world. Some people prefer a more kind of rural lifestyle to one in a mega metropolis. But I do think that there's probably some economies and diseconomies of scale associated with nation states in the same way there are with every industry. We can look at industries like the automotive industry and say that has very significant benefits from economies of scale. So you have huge car manufacturers in places like Shanghai and Wuhan, and those tend to do very well in producing cars at a affordable price level. But then you look at things like hairdressers, and you find that actually like hairdressers will tend to operate more better when they've got around 10 to 20 staff. Maybe you can have a franchise and a brand, and that does well, but individual stores will tend to have smaller numbers of people. And so you can look at different industries and see they all have different economies of scale associated with them. And I think that there could possibly be something like this going on in the market for living together. Maybe it's in the tens of thousands on a kind of Liechtenstein scale. So places like Monaco and Liechtenstein have about 35,000 people living in them. Or maybe it's more on the Hong Kong, Singapore level, where you've got 6-7 million people living together in agglomeration, which seems to work very well for them. I think on the diseconomies of scale size, the larger your territory gets and the less devolved the power gets within it, the harder it is for you to understand what's happening and make decisions that are appropriate to different kinds of local conditions. So I don't have a specific number in mind, but the kinds of figures we look at in terms of our developments when we're thinking ahead are that like 10,000 people is a good number. We've done some kind of back of the envelope calculations on what we think basic services would cost for a community of 10,000 people, and we think that it would come to something like $1,500 per year per person to have a community that functioned with just the basic government infrastructure and security. And of course, as Yago alluded to in his answers, the key thing is that we make these places attractive economically, so that even though for some people, a lot of people living in the developing world, $1,500 a year is actually a reasonable amount of money. But what these places would aim to do is create higher paying jobs. And Yago also mentioned whether these would be just places for the rich. Like, I think basic economics dictates that if you try and create a place that only has rich people, then it would just tend to get outcompeted on the market by places that have workers from across the socioeconomic spectrum joining them. Because if you have everyone that's rich, obviously any services require you to pay a premium for those services. And so you would tend to find that those places become more expensive, fewer people move to them. There may be a niche for super wealthy people that want to live in these kinds of environments. But I think in general, the mass model would be one that's just like any other business. The most successful businesses don't do well by catering just to a very small section of the population. You can do okay that way, but if you look at like all of the most valuable companies in the world, like Amazon, Google, Facebook, these are all catering to mass markets. And I think the same will be true with free private cities. The ones that will do best will generally be catering to mass markets and providing something that is good for the rich, but is also good for the the poor and helps the poor transform their situation so that they can improve their lives and become better off.
Do you have an opinion on these projects, such as those announced by Disney, such as this story living plan communities, themed communities? Do those complement, contrast your vision? Would you consult for them?
I think these things are all interesting experiments, and Disneyland itself is quite a good example of how successful a largely privately administered community could be. I've visited Disneyland in Paris, but not Disney World in Florida, which I think is the biggest one. But they're really, as I understand it, they're really immaculately run. They're very clean. They've got very efficient processes for managing the rights of way, where people can walk, how vehicles move around. And I think they show that even within the context of a traditional nation state, if you have a single private owner of land, you can achieve huge things. And I think Disney World is an example of how they've used a model like that to be greatly successful. But the things we tend to focus more on are areas where there's the chance to have a new legal framework. Because Disneyland is free to administer all of its infrastructure, but at the end of the day, if the US government turns around and says to them, we're going to increase corporation tax or get a double corporation tax or whatever it is, Disneyland still has to pay that money, and that might mean raising prices, which might mean falling revenues, which might mean that the project is less successful. So at the end of the day, Disneyland still has to work within the confines of a jurisdiction. And what we tend to focus on at the Free Private Cities Foundation and our partner organization, Tipolis, is places where there is a chance to do something innovative and different in terms of regulation and legal structures. So Disneyland's interesting, teaches us some good lessons, but it's not the sort of focus for the foundation, I would say, at the moment. It's more projects like Prospero and Morazan over in Honduras.
Gotcha. Yeah, I meant that they're planning these new branded communities, but you pretty much have answered the question regardless. Yago, in terms of people who are, looking to, I guess, sovereign-minded individuals, Sovryn's working on all sorts of stuff that's, in terms of enhancing one's personal financial sovereignty, if you're not quite able to go to some sort of, faraway city per se. Is there anything that you are working on now that would be of interest to people who are following Peter, for example?
Well, I got into Bitcoin, as I said earlier, out of this desire to create more competitive system of governance and allow 1,000 nations to bloom. And one of the lessons that I've learned along the way is that it's very, very difficult to start in the meat space. And what I mean by that is we might get lucky and find a country that is willing to go along with our crazy idea. And we might get even more lucky, and then they will actually follow through with the agreements that they sign. And we might get even more lucky, and we'll continue to work even when the government changes or people get jealous of the zone that they've created. But I think all of those things are placing our hands, our fate in the hands of luck. In my mind, one of the remarkable things about Bitcoin is it has provided us with a window to how we can create distributed, global, uncensorable, permissionless institutions, new ways of thinking about how we create institutions for man. And one of the big things, and sort of for me, the big picture of why I'm interested in Sovryn and where I see Sovryn going is taking this idea further, creating even more sophisticated ways, even a greater variety of new types of institutions that are secured by the High Court of Bitcoin and operate according to the principles of voluntary participation and permissionless, uncensorable global access. And I think the cornerstone of any freedom is financial freedom. Finance and money is power. And people need to first be able to find sovereignty in their own lives by preserving and creating wealth which allows them to be free. And then they can band together to create even higher levels and greater levels of freedom. And so the roadmap, as I see it, is with Sovryn, we are creating two things right now. We are creating a set of tools which allow people to become more financially free and more prosperous. And we are creating a community and a set of institutional tools that allow this community to govern itself and to come together and wield its collective power. And so you get two things. You get institution that anyone can be part of, a culture and a community and effectively a nation, a sovereign nation that people can be part of, and the wealth that gives this community and these institutions power. And I think that provides us ultimately with greater bargaining power. And so where I see this going, and probably faster than many people might imagine or assume, is I think that by collaborating with Peter and groups like Hippolytus, by banding together to do our own thing, by creating institutions that support people in ways which are not even geographically located. For example, negotiating with a government to allow for passports with one government, and negotiating with another government to allow for creation of new types of tax-free corporate structures. We can put together a layered system of freedoms which allow us to effectively, within possibly the next decade, have a fully functioning, sovereign, decentralized, censorship-resistant, global, and most importantly, voluntary nation, which really can take care of all of those core functions that people would like to have a nation take care of better than the monopoly systems that we have today.
All right, absolutely. Guys in the audience, if you want to ask questions, please submit requests now, and I'll start accepting those. I see a few of you have popped up questions already. In the meantime, Peter, Yago, do you have questions for each other? You're both leading very interesting organizations. Anything come to mind, gentlemen?
Sure, yeah. Happy to ask Yago a question. And it's about the mentioning of decentralized organizations that you did in your answer just now. This is something that I'm still waiting to be sold on, to be honest, because when people talk about setting up companies, and I think generally they're talking about using blockchain of some description in order to make the management of companies more decentralized. Can you just explain how that would work? Because I think my key question I have about it is that blockchains are good for providing permissionless ownership of digital assets, but they can only secure data that exists within a self-contained system. And I think the reason that Bitcoin works as money is because all you have, there's no reliance on a link between a real-world asset and something that exists on the blockchain. You just have a bearer instrument of cash, and cash money is kind of unique in that it's a bearer instrument. And it doesn't need to be convertible into any real-world asset. When you start talking about things like putting property rights on the blockchain or having voting rights on the blockchain, and having companies run in this sense, it seems to me that really what's happening is that there's a centralized organization that is inputting data into the blockchain, acting like an oracle. And so the question then would be, why go to the trouble of having this very costly blockchain-based system when in fact you can just have a very secure centralized system that is less costly and therefore more likely to outcompete these sorts of organizations that take on the cost of running a blockchain on the market?
That's a very big question. And so I'll try and answer it relatively briefly as best I can. So first of all, I don't think that it's the case that um, you can do this in a centralized way. And the reason you can't do it in a centralized way is because if you're doing it in a centralized way, so for example, through the mechanism, through the institution of the corporate person, right, the corporate entity, the way the property registration, right? So Russian Western investors invested in a bunch of Russian companies. Now they want to divest from those companies. Russia has decided they are not allowed to divest. They're not allowed to sell their shares. Do they still own those shares? To a great extent, they do not. They aren't able to vote. They aren't able to sell. They no longer have control over those shares. And so when the property and the arbitration of dispute is settled by a centralized power, it is at the whim of that centralized power, whereas a decentralized organization whose highest court is Bitcoin is not at the whim of any nation or any centralized entity whatsoever. It is code is law. Now, that brings me to the second question that you asked, which is how is this even possible, right? How can we have a system which is on the blockchain, which doesn't know about stuff that is happening external to the blockchain, wield any power in the physical space? And once again, Russia provides us with a great example. Russia has invaded Ukraine. The United States, NATO, Europe have not responded with missiles and warplanes. They have responded with crippling financial sanctions. And in fact, throughout most of human history, there was no such thing in most places as criminal law. There was only civil law. If you, according to Hammurabi, right, which is the first codex of law that we have written down, in Hammurabi's code, if you performed most types of crime, you had to pay in one way or another. You might, pay with a hand, but more frequently what you would do is instead of losing your hand, you would pay a fine. You would pay the victim to compensate them for whatever it is that you had done to them. In other words, it was civil law rather than criminal law. And this is true across most of human history. People viewed far more value in being compensated for an ill that was done to them than, sending someone to a centralized prison. So how does this relate to a DAO? Well, the way a DAO enforces things is through the power of financial incentives. So for example, if you enter into a contract, you could even see two DAOs enter into a contract, right? And they would pledge, they would stake, they would have something at stake when entering into this contract. And so if one of them broke the terms of the contract, and this could be, by doing something in the physical world, the way they would be punished is not in the physical world, but in a deterministic way, financially, for defecting from whatever agreements they had entered into. And then finally, with regards to the question of the expense and why you would do it this way, the reason I think it's valuable to construct these systems is because I think it's only expensive if you haven't, it's only apparently expensive. So computation is going to be taken off of the blockchain. We're already seeing this happen. Sovryn is working, for example, on a roll-up system which will take computation, make transactions off the chain, make transactions very cheap. Many other projects are doing similar things. And the way this will eventually play out, I think, is that the very structure of law will adapt to the greater efficiency that you can have with deterministic contracts, right? Today, every single contract between any company, is basically like a bespoke poem written by the two opposing sets of lawyers, which has only a vague relationship to reality and requires a judge to interpret the poem and its meaning. Right? This is a very liberal arts approach to how we're going to settle disputes. Programmers, they can't do that because computers are extremely stupid and can't do interpretive work. And so instead of writing poems, they write instructions. These instructions need to take into account edge cases. They need to think through all of the possibilities. And then once they've done that and managed to work through the potential bugs in the system, the way it executes is deterministic and clear to everyone. And I suspect very much that we will, over time, move away from a liberal arts approach to writing law and towards a code or programmatic way of writing law, and that we'll see very, very significant efficiencies in terms of people won't go to court and wait 5 years for a resolution. Resolutions will occur immediately, and the frictions in our economy that we're not even aware that we experience will be relieved, and this will create a huge amount of surplus productivity.
Okay, thank you, Yago, for the answer. I'm happy to take questions.
Yago, any questions on towards Peter's end? Yourself or anybody else from the audience, please feel free to put in your requests. Perhaps it looks like Wizzy got disconnected at last second here.
Yeah, sure. Peter, I would ask, is there any project that you are at liberty to speak about, which maybe people should be aware of, that you think you can discuss? And one way or another, is there a way that people can get involved with the work that you're doing that maybe they'd be interested in hearing about?
So I mentioned the two Honduran projects, which people are very welcome to go and look into if they'd like to. One of them's got a website, www.prospera.hn, I believe, and then the other is morazan.hn, I believe. But if you can't find them, type in those names, Morazan or Prospera, and ZA or Honduras, and you should get them from a Google search. There's also other projects we do have in the pipeline. I can pass on that we are working with a West African government at the moment to try and establish a new prosperity zone within this country. Because of the fact that negotiations are still going on there, we can't mention the country name at the moment, but that's something that I hope we'll be able to share more on in the next couple of months. If people would like to get involved with the foundation, I think there are various things you can do. First of all, you can get in touch with us to find out about what free private cities aligned projects exist around the world. I've given you a couple of examples, and we can provide you information on how you might invest in them or how you might move to them. We can put you in contact with those people. One of the aims of our foundation is to accelerate the adoption and creation of a market for living together. So we want people who are proposing new projects to be successful on a market-based model. And we see our role as making the moral case for free private cities over conventional governance, but also helping get investors and potential emigres to these zones in touch with the places so that the whole thing will be able to move forward more quickly than it otherwise would. So if that's of interest, you can add me on Twitter, you can follow me and DM me and let me know what your situation is and if there's a way we can help. You can also subscribe to our newsletter. So we've got a website, www.freeprivatecities.com. If you scroll to the bottom of the main page, there's a button there that says subscribe. And if you subscribe to that, there'll be a quarterly update email. So we don't spam you. We try and keep these emails relatively infrequent, but in the quarterly emails, we'll provide you an update of what the status of free private cities aligned projects are around the world, whether there are any other developments within nation states that we see as being relevant to our audience of people that value self-sovereignty highly, such as the Bitcoin city development. We wrote about that in our last newsletter, and we keep track of broader global developments, even if we're not personally involved in them, to give people a bit of an overview of what's going down within the autonomous development space. So you can follow us, subscribe us to our newsletter. You can also, if you agree with the mission, you can also support us by making a donation. If that's of interest, you can DM me and I'll pass on the details to you. The best thing I think we want people to do is to actually move to these developments and invest in them, be part of the communities, because that's what really ensures the long-term success of alternative governance models.
Great. And before we wrap up, I did get a question on Discord from Julio, asking if you gents would ever move somewhere like Bitcoin City or similar.
So yeah, happy to go first on that one. I would certainly consider moving to Bitcoin City and am. I'm a UK national and I'm looking to establish some kind of base in the UK, even though I'm not particularly bullish on the UK's governance model and future at the moment, because I think not for the reasons that many people talk about. Many people talk about Brexit and say this is a bad thing for Britain, and many people talk about the sort of rise of more right-wing forces, but I actually see it very differently. I think we've seen a very high increase in statism in most Western nation states with the rise of COVID. There's much more power in the hands of government than there was a couple of years ago. Lives are restricted much more than they used to be. And I don't think this is great for the long-term future of states that adopt those kinds of policies. And unfortunately, I put the UK in that category. I'm looking to establish a base there myself because that's the country that I was born in and I've got family and friends based there. But in terms of where I actually live, I'm seriously considering El Salvador as an option because of its adoption of Bitcoin as legal tender. I'm hugely passionate about Bitcoin and I've spent time in El Salvador, about 5 weeks in total, and it's really encouraging to see the way in which Bitcoin is being adopted slowly but surely by the Salvadorian population. And the idea of having a place where I could have a ringside seat to all of that and potentially get involved with exciting new urban innovation projects like Bitcoin City is really appealing. So maybe ask me in a year's time, once I've had a chance to sort out my UK stuff, and you might find that I'm in El Salvador or another Latin American state for the longer term.
For me, the answer is 100% yes. I strong believer in voting with your feet, living a life aligned with your values and ideals, and going to the place that treats you best. And I also believe that the best way to live in a future that we would like to live in is to create it. And so with the Sovryn community, my long-term goal is to create the kind of place that I and other people who are like me would like to live. And maybe it's not one place. Most likely and ideally it would be many. And we would have the ability to choose, not just based on culture and laws, but also in terms of our preferences in weather, location, geography, to live in a place which aligns with our values and interests. I am extremely optimistic about the future. I know that our world right now is a world of cynicism, irony, nihilism, and pessimism. I think that's extremely short-sighted, and I think it's primarily due to a lack of imagination. If there's one curse of our current age, it's a lack of imagination of what the future could be. I think we need to look past the ideas of the past. I think we need to look past this old 20th century idea of right versus left, and we need to go and create new constructs, new institutions, and new zones which speak to the adventure, the innovation, and the future that we all want to create. And so for me, that's my purpose. That's what I engage in. That's why I do the things that I do. And I have a high degree of confidence that we are going to get there before the decade is out.
Thanks for the answers, gentlemen. Really appreciate both of your time. Guys, follow them, Eden Yago, at Eden Yago, Peter Young, it's at Peter M.I. Young. And don't forget to follow us at Sovryn BTC, folks. You can, we're doing a lot of fun stuff with Sovryn Mayhem right now, so you can win Sov by doing all sorts of activities. We're doing meme contests, all that jazz. Just yesterday, 197 people entered our latest competition. Winners are going to be announced tomorrow if you're listening and you're part of that competition. So head on over to Sovryn BTC if you want to join in on the mayhem. And also don't forget there's at Free Private City if you want to keep up with Peter's work and all of his team. And just really interesting, isn't it? So thanks a lot, everyone, for tuning in. And remember, stay sovereign. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you. Stay sovereign.
Thanks, Magnus. Thanks,
Bye.
Leo.